Hey everyone, this is James from TDB. I'm bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking about finding value when just shopping for tea online. So really in this episode talking a bit about like getting the most bang for your buck. Honestly, this is a very kind of subjective subject, so I'm going to be approaching it, semi-conceptually rather than you need to go to these three places in order to get the highest value of tea. Of course, I will be kind of bundling in a couple different vendor recommendations within here, just people that I have found success with in terms of, in my opinion, value. But there's certainly a lot of room for subjectivity. Some people don't like drinking Taiwanese oolong. Some people don't like drinking Wu oolong. So, your mileage is going to significantly vary depending on your specific taste. One thing that I did want to quickly mention from the top is a lot of the best deals that I've had are from knowing a guy or knowing a guy who knows a guy who puts together a deal where you're buying a bunch of cakes or something like that. And I'm less interested in covering that in here because, I think I generally am not a big fan of the advice. It's like, oh, you want to drink better tea? You need to get better tea friends or something like that. I think there's a better value in terms of advice given in just terms of saying, in terms of just finding good sources and good vendors. And maybe these connections and sources will come to you eventually, but maybe not. I think it's presumptuous to assume that everyone will eventually end up with like super strong connections or things like that. A lot of these things are definitely very lucky, and a lot of the great connections I've had are from the result of having a YouTube channel and things like that. So that's like something that you can't expect most people to necessarily have. So I want to talk about sources and things like that that are accessible where people can go online and they can just buy tea. Okay, so let's move on. So I think one of the big main concepts I want to talk about too is a very logical one. It's getting closer to the source. One thing you can think about is just how many times the tea has passed the hand. How close is the source that you're buying the tea from to the tea? So one way to think about this is, okay, so I have a vendor, but my vendor bought it from another vendor. So you're almost always better off buying it from the vendor that sold it to the other vendor while ignoring kind of the vendor a little bit further down the food chain. So that's important just because each vendor is going to make some amount of money off them, even if they are a very low markup vendor. And so the tea just ends up getting more expensive the more times it chases hands. So very, very logical. A couple good examples here. Like Yunnan Sourcing, I think one reason they are able to offer very reasonable prices is they're very, very close to the source. Certainly in the case of Yunnan tea, but Scott is just a very active seller, so he's able to, I think in general he's not a bad place to go for quite a wide variety of tea. A couple other examples: Wui Origin is obviously very closely connected with their farm and the location there. Taiwanese oolong wise, I always like to cite Tea Home. I think that's definitely one of the closest tea vendors to them because they are, actually sourcing tea themselves and they're based in Nantou, so kind of the Dongjing area. So they are very, very close to the different sources, even if the tea you're buying isn't necessarily the ones from their exact farm. Those are just a couple different things, different ways that, just getting a little bit closer to the source, you get tea that's a lot more inexpensive. In the case of Tea Home, if you compare their tea versus like a more U.S.-based vendor that sells Taiwanese oolongs, their prices are way lower. And it's just because everyone needs to make money. I don't fault anyone. There's definitely value that people are providing in terms of making things accessible to people out here. But if you can get closer to the source, you can definitely get the tea for a little bit less than you would if you bought stuff from, someone that's third or fourth down the line. Some categories are just, easier to get kind of relative bang for your buck value. Good example of this is just ripe versus raw. Ripe usually uses lower quality material. And if you restricted yourself to kind of 10 cents a gram, you'd get very average ripe, but you get kind of shittier young raw pu'er. Your mileage is going to vary depending on which types of tea you actually do like and which one's there. If you really wanted to be on a budget and you wanted to drink compared to kind of the relative quality of tea, average tea, then like ripe and other kind of low cost categories are good ones to kind of hammer home on if you like that type of tea. Other ones like Wui Oolong, in my opinion, are a little bit harder to get sort of that value. Another area that I think is a little undercovered, and this one's a little tricky, but there are some brands that you can buy from online, and it's the brands that are very focused not on a Western audience, but on kind of, either a Chinese-speaking audience, so something like Peksun Chun in Singapore, where it's like very, very workman-like tea. So kind of these either Chinese or Hong Kong or Singaporean brands that are focused on just selling ordinary tea for ordinary people. And I think a lot of people can find pretty good mileage there as far as looking for daily tea. If you look at Peksun Chun, you have to pay a bunch of shipping costs and stuff like that. And the tea isn't like dirt cheap, but it's very inexpensive. And so if you do like those kind of inexpensive but kind of robust, solid Chinese oolong taste, those are another places to go. I've talked in the past about Sea Dyke brand. That's something that you might be able to find in certain stores locally here. It's not great tea by any means, but it's often solid, and I think some people would be surprised how decent it is, and how drinkable it is at times. Some categories I don't know exactly where to find value from, so something like Dansang, I just don't drink it that much, so I don't know where the best value is. Mainland tea guanyin, I also have no idea. So not going to be covering those, a little bit less too. Another place is just looking for kind of less fancy options. Yiwu tea has a reputation for being very, very pricey, but sometimes when you actually look at what like the different people are selling, so for instance, Tea Pals in the past has sold a bunch of Chen Yuan Hao. Chen Yuan Hao produces a lot of Yiwu, and a lot of them are kind of specified, specific mountains, specific area, specific village, yada yada. But they'll also often produce just kind of a very basic Yiwu blend that is lower quality material. I think some of it's probably plantation, Taiji Cha. And so you can aim for kind of those. And that way you can kind of get the Yiwu, basic profile for quite a bit less money rather than aiming for something that's a fair bit more expensive. I know Tea Urchin in the past has also offered something like this. I don't necessarily keep up to date on my young poor stuff, but it is often possible, if you're okay with kind of slightly lesser material, stuff that's probably more blended rather than single origin, to look at for it that way. So I mean, blending also a good way to kind of look for value. Generally speaking, blends are not necessarily intended to be super high-end. Of course, there are always exceptions to that. White tea in particular likes to make a lot of very high-end blends, or very expensive blends, I should say. Just something to keep in mind there too. I mean, as I talked about too, it's like certain categories like ripe is just a better value in some ways than raw. I think for me at least, if you restricted me to just drinking 10 cent a gram pur, I'd almost always just drink ripe because I prefer that kind of basic profile and the way that tea is processed when it comes to lower quality material and creating something drinkable rather than kind of some very, very rough 10 cent a gram young raw pur. Okay, so another area to look for value too is in semi-aged tea. And you can look at this in Yunnan Sourcing or King Tea Mall, or a variety of different vendors. So why is semi-aged often, in my opinion, a better value than young? Well, part of it is just because young tea has risen so much in value. And yes, it's true that some semi-aged tea is going to, rise up in value. A good example of this is Yunnan Sourcing, who every year will raise their older stock up by a certain amount, and over time that will add up a bit. So that's an example of maybe semi-aged not being necessarily a better deal than the young tea. But that's not the case for all semi-aged. You can certainly find other people who have bought tea a while ago and are happy to sell it at at a price that hasn't necessarily kept up with the current Malchow market. So I don't find these teas particularly hard to find, but you can definitely find a lot of semi-aged tea that's very, very reasonably priced, certainly under 20 cents a gram. You just have to be kind of okay buying, some stuff that's like maybe not necessarily the highest sought after. the most sought after stuff. For instance, like if you had a verified Lao Banjiang from 2013 or something like that, that undoubtedly has gone up quite a bit in price. Whereas something that like kind of random dye blend from 2013 might be a much more modest rise. And it's not necessarily always in terms of like what is the tea quality. Certain teas will get popular for reasons, and certain teas will not, even if the reasons why certain teas are popular don't necessarily, it could just be some popular person talked about that tea, or it just got hot because it did well in some sort of tasting or whatnot. Dai makes a lot of different tea per year. There's just a whole lot of pu'er being produced, and so certain teas will get popular and get pricey, and other teas will not. And that doesn't necessarily mean the teas that are not popular aren't good. They could be very well decent and very, very good functional teas. So semi-aged pu'er, I've said this many times, is a great place to seek out different values. So in the end, I think if you were to shop at something like 10 cents a gram, which in my opinion is a very value-oriented thing. I mean, you can do a 5 gram session for 50 cents. I mean, you're talking, even if you are a tea glutton, a 10 gram session every time, that's like $1 per session. I don't consider that particularly expensive. I think you can get some pretty decent options when it comes to ripe pu'er, Taiwanese oolongs, kind of the Chinese brand oolongs, and semi-aged pu'er. I think semi-aged pu'er in particular, I think is going to be slightly more challenging, but I think if you extend that to maybe like 12 to 15 cents a gram, I think you're going to have quite a few more options. That's a little bit about talking about finding value in pu'er. So if you're someone that is very, very budget conscious and don't want to spend a lot of time don't want to spend a lot of money on tea, but are just still very into it, I think it's absolutely possible to explore the hobby. Part of the challenge, though, is sometimes the best deal also is spending a fair bit up front, so putting in that $200 order, but you're buying a lot of tea with that rather than kind of buying by the seat of your pants. I think you will generally come out better if you're willing to kind of front a little bit of upfront cost in terms of purchasing from different places. Okay, so that's some of my thoughts on finding value in kind of the different tea categories. Let me know what you agree with. Let me know what you disagree with. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.